Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to start the new Mosaic Damascus Bowie build. Let's get right to it. Okay, let's talk about the Damascus pattern for this knife. So I'm going to go with something kind of bold. So it's not going to be a ton of layers. I think total layers is 23 layers, but a couple of these are doubled up layers, which is going to give us our mosaic. If you're curious on how to do mosaic, I'll put a link up in the corner to a video I just released a little while ago about Intro to Mosaic Damascus. One key to Mosaic Damascus is that there's different thicknesses of layers, and that's what gives you your pattern. So I had to be really careful in setting up the billet for this. As usual, I'm MIG welding the corners of the billet just to keep it together. I don't like to run a line of MIG weld down the side just because then I have to grind it off, and stay tuned, you'll see that becomes a problem later.
I always have people ask me what this is. This is kerosene that I dip the billet in just to make sure that it seeps into all the seams and I get a good forge weld. Once I've got it up to forge welding temperature, I take the billet and the first press I just gently press on it just to compress it just a little bit to set the weld. Repeat this for 2 more heats until I'm sure it's good and welded before I get aggressive and start compressing it. I like to grind off the MIG weld just to make sure I don't get any in the billet. Because it's on the corners, I probably don't need to do this, but I still do. For this pattern, I'll be forging this down into a square bar, not a flat bar, because I need to square off the corners, so I want it to be square.
This is what it's going to look like. I'm going to start the layers in this configuration, squish the corners, then I'm actually going to re-square right in this heat.
I'm using the squaring dies to square off this billet, and then I want to stretch it out because I'm going to have to cut this into 4, so I need this billet to be pretty long. You can do this without squaring dies and just use flat dies, but this sure makes it easier. As you can see, I had a little bit of a problem here. This isn't good and this has to be ground off. I started grinding on the 2x72 and realized I was just wasting belt, so moved over to the angle grinder. After a few minutes with the angle grinder, I managed to grind all of that off and it looks pretty good. Now back to the forge for one more heat just to square it off before I cut it up.
So here it is after the first forging. The only thing I'm a little concerned about, if you can see that, is that I'm not quite getting the pattern, at least on the end. And you saw that I had a bunch of, I don't know what it was. I think I actually burned the steel a little bit because the end of the forge that this was in was a little hotter, quite a bit hotter. So I think I burned a bunch of the steel, so I had to grind that down. So I'll cut the ends off it, take a look at the pattern. It just might not be quite as pronounced as this, but we'll see.
Here's that new Wen metal cutting saw. I just did an unboxing and a review of this one, so you can check that out.
So that's what the end looks like after being etched. Pretty good. Let's look at the other end. Yeah, so pretty much what I wanted. So let's cut it up, restack it into 4, get it back in the forge.
For these mosaic patterns, you got to make sure you get your bars in the right orientation. So I always like to draw on them and number them so that I know exactly where they go. Now it's time to clean the touching sides so we can get our forge weld nice and clean. Here's where I learned a new trick by first doing it the hard way. I wanted to make sure I sealed this whole thing up, so I welded all of the seams, including the sides. And that presented a problem, and you'll see why. The problem here is as soon as I put this in the squaring dies, it squished that weld into the seam and pushed it in deeper than I wanted. I had to grind that out. I didn't show it here, but it wasn't much fun. The good thing that came out of this is I learned a cool technique that I'll show you in the next forge weld that I do to combat this. Like in the last forging, I want to forge this out into a long square bar because I'm going to slice this up and do the same thing that I did already, cut it into 4 and rotate it. As you can imagine, forge welding this by hand with a hammer is virtually impossible. There's just so much you would need to do. You really need a forge press to do mosaics. I want to make sure this is as straight as possible with as sharp corners as possible, since I'm going to be forge welding this back again into a square. I'm pretty happy with the pattern here. It actually looks pretty close to my drawing, so it turned out like I expected. Now it's time to clean up the touching edges again, MIG weld them together, and then get them back in the forge for a forge weld. So here's the trick that I learned. After I did the MIG weld, I went to the grinder and ground down the MIG weld. So really there's just a really thin layer over top of the seams, but that's enough to keep the air out, and that's all I need. All the scale coming off while I was forging it on the press, I think took all that MIG weld off. But if it didn't, it certainly came off when I grind it in the next step.
Here it is after forging the mosaic. Looks really good. Now I gotta slice it up and tile it, and then we'll get our pattern. So here it is after it's cooled down. I've ground opposite sides because I'm gonna cut it on angles like this in the tiles, and these faces rather, are the ones that are going to meet up. So I'm going to actually do this in the bandsaw. We don't lose as much material. So let's cut it up into slices like this. So I've got all of my mosaic tiles all cut up. I've ground these edges here that are going to touch. So I got 6 tiles out of it, which is pretty good. You can see, and they're pretty thick, maybe 3/4 of an inch. I'll show you what the pattern is. I etched one tile. If it'll focus. Come on, there it is. So that's what it's going to look like. I think it turned out really well. And this is what I'm going to use as my end piece here. Okay, I've got this 1/16 inch mild steel that I'm just going to weld them to. Weld this on top, weld all the seams so I get a nice airtight weld. Let's do it.
This is a really important forge weld, so I want to make sure I get this one done perfectly. I want to get this one really hot. It doesn't look like it in the camera, but this one is really, really hot. After setting the welds, I noticed my billet was getting pretty long and I didn't really need that. So I started putting the fullering dies sideways so that I could get some width out of it. Now I'm pressing down any peaks and valleys caused by the fullering dies, and then a final flattening just so that I have a nice solid billet to start with. The first thing I got to do is grind off all the sacrificial steel that I used to hold the mosaic together. I would normally do this with an angle grinder, but my wife was on an important phone call, so I didn't want to make a lot of noise. Okay, she's done. Time to make this go a little faster. After I got the majority of the mild steel off with the angle grinder, I took it to the surface grinder just to get it nice and flat on both sides.
So here's the billet, all ground, surface ground. It's just a hair under 1/4 inch thick, but it's nice and flat now. I've etched it. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's etched. It looks amazing. Now, let's put the profile on it. So I'm just going to put it about there, and then I annealed this, so hopefully it's pretty easy to cut. I'm going to do most of this on the bandsaw. Okay.
This was pretty easy to cut with the bandsaw. I also saved a bunch of these pieces, and you'll see why later when I do the heat treat. Now I'm just grinding the profile and getting it all nice and shaped. You'll notice this was mostly a stock removal project after the billet was formed. That's because I don't want to distort the pattern by trying to forge in bevels or anything like that. You never want to do that with a mosaic. I know some of you may be sick of hearing it, but I love this grinder. Upgrading to the Broadbeck has been one of the best decisions I've made in a while. I thought I could do this radius with the small wheel. It ends up being a little too large for this, so I have to go to a file afterwards. After looking at the knife, I was thinking it was just a little too thick. I don't like big, heavy, thick knives. So I wanted to take this back to the surface grinder and take a little bit off it. It ends up more around 3/16, which is more what I think it should be for this knife.
So I've got it resurface ground to a better thickness. It's probably 3/16 around there. So that's kind of what I wanted. I'm going to put some marking lines on here. I want to do the false edge now. And then, then do the bevel.
Doing the false edge is kind of time consuming. Probably took me over an hour, close to an hour and a half to do both sides. But this is what I find the most accurate. Trying to do it on the grinder, it's just too easy to screw it up. I also find it a lot better to do the false edge before you do your bevel, because you want that top false edge to taper perfectly to the tip. You can do that by controlling your bevel when you get close to the tip of the knife. This part, the free grinding of the bevel, this is definitely the hardest part and takes the most practice. That's what everyone wants to be able to do. Guys, there's no excuse, just you got to put in the time and practice. This is just the initial bevel before heat treat. So this one, I'll usually keep it between 1/4 and 1/2 inch from where I want it to be. I'll do the rest as part of the final grind after the heat treat.
All right, we got the initial grinding done, false edge is done. It looks pretty good. Now, time for some normalization and then heat treat.
The blade's already gone through 3 normalization cycles at 1600, 1450, and 1250. Now for the quench. Like always, I check for warps first. You got all the time in the world to check if it's hard. Here I'm using a 65 HRC file to test to see how hard it is. Now it's going in my steel plate setup so it stays straight during the temper.
What I'm going to do now is I've got a couple extra pieces in there from the same billet, just cut-offs. I've done this whole normalization cycle exactly the same as the blade. I'm going to quench those and do a snap test on them just to see what the grain structure is like. Well, I forgot to turn the camera on for the actual snap, but you can see the grain pattern is pretty fine, especially on these two here. It's very powdery, and that's what you want. I can see the grains in the Damascus here, which is interesting and to be expected, but pretty good grain structure. There's another shot. The bottom one looks a little gray because I touched it with my finger and I got some grease on it, but you can see there, the inside looks like flour, not sugar, which is really good.
Here I'm just using the surface grinder and a 120 grit belt just to do the flats. On this knife, since the blade is kind of thick, I decided to mill down the tang so that there's a shelf that the guard is going to sit against, so it will be nice and flush. Now it's time for final grinding and bringing this thing down to a really tight edge. I'm also going to bring the bevel up towards the spine, probably within about 1/4 inch of the spine. Here's everyone's favorite part, the hand sanding. Green Beetle once did a video of 1 hour of hand sanding, which I actually thought was pretty funny. Not that I watched the whole thing. My hand sanding regimen is to start at 220, 400, 800, 1000. I also change direction by 45 degrees at every grit. One thing that I've been doing lately is changing the angle between the flats and the bevel, and that actually brings out your line quite a bit, so I've been doing that one as well.
Okay folks, here it is after some hand sanding. This is down to 220, so I'll take it probably to 800 before I fit the guard. But I like how it's turned out. It's got nice lines, nice crisp lines on it so far.
We're going to continue this Mosaic Damascus Bowie build, and here I'm flattening out this piece of Damascus to use for the guard. I had a little bit of work at the anvil to get the length I needed out of this material to make the guard.
I've done a rough forging on the guard. So it'll be ready for grinding. But in the meantime, let's work on the handle material. What I've selected is, first off, the main handle is going to be this maple burl. It's a brown maple burl. Looks really nice, got some great figuring in it. Then, this is from a previous project, and the camera is not going to do it justice right now until it's polished and shine, because it's only got like a 60 grit finish on here. But this is a really, really nice burl, really dark with some orangey browns in it. It'll go really nice against this one. And then I'm going to put white G10 in between each one. So it'll look something like that. And then that, of course, will be there. Let's get it glued up. And the one thing that I always advise for something like this, and actually sometimes is the reason that I do it, because of the curved tang, it's really hard to drill the slot for this. So that's why I like doing these in two separate pieces. So I'll glue all these together, drill through these, fit them, and then once I have it fit, then I'll mark the handle, and I'll only have to drill the tang slot on this just a little bit, and it'll be straight. So good little trick there. Okay, here's the guard, all flattened out. I've done a bit of grinding on it, one flat side, just so I can put it in the mill and then mill the other side parallel. So, time for a bunch of milling operations. Let's go do it.
After I milled the other side parallel, I was able to flip it over and do the slot for the guard.
Here's the guard all slotted. If we put it on the knife, you'll see it, if you can see that, it almost fits. Okay, it's just missing a little bit. So what we're going to do is put it in the vise inside of a piece of leather. Okay, make sure it's not hitting down here. And I'm going to lock just the blade in the vise really tight. Okay, make sure this goes on the right way. Okay, then I'm going to put some leather just to protect the guard. Put a little washer here in my fancy dancy tube, and I'm just going to give it a couple of whacks with a hammer. And sometimes you need to flip this around because it'll pivot on you. Here's a better shot of the guard. Nice and fit up.
Now it's time to shape the guard on the grinder and get the profile we want. I decided I wanted line-up pins, so here I'm drilling holes for those. Okay, do you see the problem here? I'm about to scream as soon as I find out. Yep, I put the hole on the top side of the guard instead of the bottom. Here I'm using the acetylene torch to bend the front the other way.
So there it is, crisis averted. I just bent the tip down. This will still get ground up a little bit here. So all's well. It was just a pain in the ass.
Time to heat treat the guard to make sure it gets the same etch as the blade. Here I'm putting a taper on my line-up pins with a drill against the grinder, just so they have a nice point to go into the wood. I like to sand the blade down to 800, put my maker's mark, and then do my final sanding to 1000 after all my fit up is done for the guard. Now it's time to drill the holes in the handle pieces so I can start fitting them up against the guard.
So I've got the handle all glued up. I've just taken a wax marker and just drawn out where I want the handle to be. I've drawn the tang here. I made a little mistake when I drilled the hole, so the hole for the tang goes up a little high, so I had to bring the handle up a bit higher than I wanted, but I think it'll work out well. Yeah. So now I'm going to do some rough profiling on the handle and then start working on this part of the guard.
Here you can see how much mess this makes, even with a dust collection system.
Okay, time to do the hole for the pin. I'm going to use this Mosaic pin, and it's only going to have a single pin right here. So the first trick here is you want to make sure you have your handle all squared up, because if you don't, and your handle's on an angle, that means your pin is going to go in on an angle when you drill it. So what I do is draw out the tang. So now I know approximately where my pin's going to be. Since the tang is at a bit of an angle, I think I'm going to put it a little bit closer because I want it centered here. So I'm probably going to put it right there.
My pin material is 3/16, but I'm actually drilling a 1/4 inch hole here just to have a little play. Time to do the final shaping on the handle. I start by tapering it towards the guard, and then move on to putting the contours on the edges. Just some final cleanup grinding on the guard, and I think we're ready to go.
Time for the final etch. Be 3 cycles of 10 minutes. There it is, fresh out of the coffee. Now into the oven to bake on the oxides before we shine it up and show the pattern.